Hey friends, this is Michael Bohm with Youth Apologetics Training. Today we're going to keep going with this series about the treatment of women in the Bible. Is it chauvinistic? Is it misogynistic? Is it degrading to women? Are women nothing more than household slaves, according to the Bible? That's what we're talking about in this series. We're going to look at some of the objections to the Bible and some of the things the Bible says that are a little bit difficult concerning this subject. Some scriptures that have been latched onto by atheists and feminists alike, and, well, can even cause some new believers to stumble and fall flat on their face. I have been asked to do this series by so many people just in the last few months that it just came to the point where it's like, I've got to do this. I've got to do this. And so yesterday we looked at some scriptures from the Bible that show the woman's worth, that give you an idea of how God sees the woman. I think some of the more notable ones, Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither bond nor free, there's neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, likewise ye husbands dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Your prayers can actually be hindered by mistreating your wife, by not giving her that honor. And you can contrast that with sayings like this from the Quran, Surah chapter 4, verse 34. If you fear high-handedness from your wives, remind them of the teaching of God. Then ignore them when you go to bed. Then hit them. If they obey you, you have no right to act against them. God is most high and great. That's the Quran for you. Okay? In the Hadith, right? Again, this is for those who have not listened to my series on Islam. The Hadith is another book, or actually a collection of writings that are considered pretty much inspired. They're not held in high esteem like the Quran, and a good majority of Muslims have never read the Hadith. It is a large body of material, but you have sayings like this. Muhammad, according to the Hadith, said, "Is not the evidence of two women equal to the witness of one man?" They replied in the affirmative. He said, "This is the deficiency in her intelligence." Okay, that was, oh good grief, I'm going to mispronounce this. Bukhari, 6, verse 301. Then Bukhari 2, verse 28. Women comprise the majority of hell's occupants. Are you kidding me? Now, that's interesting because the only women that are actually ever mentioned in heaven by Muhammad are the virgins. Okay, the virgins, the 72 virgins that have to wait on these men hand and foot and fulfill their every desire for eternity. That's pretty awesome, don't you think? And I'm being very sarcastic in case you don't know me. Oh, man. When you look at, actually interesting about that, if you look at Mormonism, there's somewhat of a similar concept that when women die, when the wife dies, all right, and the man has fulfilled all the things that really, make him eligible to become a god and have his own planet. Well, the man has the power and the authority to call forth his wife from the grave. If he doesn't choose to, she stays there. That's right. She stays there. And so some Freudian slip. Some Mormon men actually hold that above their wives' heads as kind of a, you better listen to me because, I have the power to call you from the grave. I've read that there's actually some Mormon men that pull that kind of stunt on women. Now, I'm sure most of them don't, okay? So all you Mormon friends out there, don't throw rocks at me just yet. But I'm right. There are some men out there that pull that. And that is a true doctrine. Okay? And then the Mormon man, okay, he gets to be the god of his own planet. And his wife, along with other spirit wives, are stuck with the task of creating millions and millions of spirit babies for all eternity, spending eternally pregnant, okay, or being impregnated. That sounds awesome. That sounds like women are being glorified and lifted up, don't you think? You don't see that as much nowadays, but back in the 1800s when Mormonism was still, in its infancy, Joseph Smith, he had a lot of wives. I mean, a lot of wives. That dude, he was so corrupt. He was stealing women from his friends. I mean, like taking his friends' wives. In fact, oh boy, I don't have my facts straight. I used to know this. I forget so much. It seems to me like Joseph Smith actually took one of his son's wives. I'll think about that for a second. But women were seen basically as a possession, even in early Mormonism. Now, again, it's not so much nowadays. Nowadays, it seems to me that, Mormonism is kind of like a chameleon. It fits into the culture and blends right in. Nowadays, you don't see that as much. In fact, not much at all. Women are, for the most part, held in the same esteem that you would see coming from the Christian church. But anyway, let's take a trip back to ancient Greece, where we see the time of Christ and the culture of which Christ came into this earth. And what he was working with, the culture that surrounded him. And let's look at that culture, and then let's look how he treated women. So in ancient Greece, women generally, respectable women that were not prostitutes, were not allowed to leave the house unless they were accompanied by a trustworthy male escort. Women were not permitted to eat or interact with male guests in her husband's home. She had to retire to her women's quarters. Women were basically slaves, okay? Their life was basically, they were servants of the husbands. Women were not allowed an education. They were not allowed to speak in public. Women were inferior to men. Women under the Roman culture, again, very similar. Women were basically servants of the men. Men owned the woman as well as the kids, but he owned the woman and all of her possessions. He could divorce his wife if she simply went out in public without a veil on. Kind of sounds like Islam in some ways. The man had a power over his wife, basically over life and death. Okay, this is referred to as, and I know I'm going to butcher this, but patria potestas. And basically, I mean, he had power over the woman to the point of life and death. Again, it almost sounds like Islam. As far as the treatment of women in the Jewish culture of that time, again, very similar. Women were not allowed to speak in public. Women were not allowed to read the Torah out loud. That's from the oral law, okay? At synagogue, women were to be separated from the men. They had to sit on the other side of the room. Actually, it's kind of interesting. I know a couple, who go to a very, very hyper messianic type church. And at least they used to. I'm pretty certain they still do. And they had to sit on opposite sides of the room with a wall in between them. Okay, isn't that weird? Okay, so the men couldn't look over and see the women. And the women could not look over and see the men. And so you couldn't have any of that communication going back and forth. All the women had to have their heads covered in their synagogue/church, whatever you'd want to call it. Very, very legalistic. Oh my goodness. Very legalistic. And, one of these days I'll do a series on the pitfalls of the Messianic movement. There's some good Messianic churches out there. I hate to say it, but most of them that I see are steeped in legalism, and the fruit of that is rotten. Just rotten. But anyway, don't want to go down that rabbit trail. So we see the background of Christ when he comes into the world. And here you have a man who steps out into this culture, these conflicting Greek, Roman, and Jewish cultures. Yeah. And as you look at how Jesus interacts with women, he completely turns these cultures on their head. And again, like I mentioned before, you don't see an out-and-out explicit denunciation of these various cultures. I don't know why that is, okay? I really don't. I mean, some of the problems that you find in society, God dealt with head on, outright, just in your face, addressed these subjects in the Bible, like different various sins, unbelief, all kinds of things. But when you talk about matters like slavery and the treatment of women, it's a little more subtle, okay? And I don't know why that is. But you see this thing happen in the New Testament where God works within the culture, all right? He works within the culture that these people find themselves in. I don't know why that is. I don't know why God does that. But I do know that Christianity, here would be one of my theories, Christianity was controversial enough, okay? And perhaps what God was doing was teaching, showing by example and through various scriptures throughout the New Testament how women were to be treated. And as the status of women was elevated, the rest of the world saw that and became jealous. And perhaps it was another form of evangelism, as women were looking on at these Christians and saying, wow, I mean, they're like queens in their own households. And, relatively speaking, compared to the rest of the culture. I don't know. It's hard to say. But the effects, the fruit of the New Testament, of Christ's teachings, and how he taught or how he treated women, the fruit is very obvious. In every culture that Christianity has infiltrated and touched, you see that awesome fruit. And so, for example, here we have a culture, again, where women are not allowed to have leadership roles. They're not allowed to teach. They're not allowed to get an education, hold positions of responsibility. And then you have women in the New Testament, like Mary, Jesus' mother, Dorcas, Julia, Lydia, Persis, Priscilla, Phoebe, Tryphena, Tryphosa, okay, and on and on. Rabbinic oral law even states things like, he who talks with a woman in public brings evil upon himself. One is not so much as to greet a woman. And then we see Jesus sitting down next to a woman at the well, asking her for a drink. I mean, she's just shocked that this guy would even talk to her, let alone the fact, the type of man that he was. But she's just shocked that he's even going to talk to her. And then when the disciples show up, they're shocked and amazed. They're looking at Jesus going, what are you doing? Why are you talking to this woman? And here we have Christ having this conversation with her, and it leads to her conversion. In a sense, I mean, she starts following after Christ at this point. Jesus ministers to women who've committed adultery. He ministers to prostitutes. I mean, in this culture, in this time, the Jews must have been coming out of their skin. And looking at the Greeks and the Romans, they're thinking, what's with this guy? And quite possibly this might have led to some of the animosity towards Jesus. Perhaps. During one meal, one evening, with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, we have a situation where Martha, she pretty much takes the traditional female role, and she's off preparing a meal for Jesus. You have Mary, who's sitting there learning from Jesus, and he's talking with her. Okay, again, just totally turning this oral law on its head. And Jesus commends Mary for wanting to learn from him. Another thing that I think is awesome is the fact that women's testimony, I think I mentioned this earlier. A woman's testimony really had no authority in that time. Okay, it took two women to equal the testimony of one man. And I think it's interesting that the first women to show up and to testify of Christ's resurrection, the first people to show up were women, which again turned the Jewish culture on its head. Here we have the women being the first ones to show up and find out that the body's gone. It's also important and interesting to note that most of the men during the crucifixion, most of the men fled like a bunch of cowards. I'm not saying I would have been any better, but guess who was there? Guess who was risking their life? It was the women. Now, as some atheists would like to think, and feminists and just secular humanists would like to think that the Bible is just a concocted story, do you honestly think that in that culture they would have concocted a story where the women who had, no authority as far as testifying certain things, their testimony was next to worthless? Why in the world would they have this story where the women are the ones who show up at the tomb? The women are the ones who have the backbone to stand there while Christ is being crucified and not run in fear, scared that they might get crucified as well. So anyway, I'll stop right there. I've gone a little long. No big deal. Friends, if you like this podcast, I ask you, I urge you, please share this stuff. Please get this message out. Spread it around. Share it on whatever social media platforms, or just tell people that you know about this program. Let's get this message out. Let's try to equip believers. And hey, let's get some people saved. So with that, I love you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.